I want to understand glaciers and ice sheets because they're really good indicators of climate change and they can tell us about things like sea level rise.
What I want to know is how food webs in the Antarctic Ocean functions and how top predators can adapt to climate change.
I'm studying coastal erosion on the north slope of Alaska, and I want to understand whether erosion rates have actually accelerated in the past 50 years, and if so, how that might be related to climate change and warming of the Beaufort Sea.
I want to figure out how the mass of the ice sheets are changing, because that affects global sea level and everyone who lives on the coast.
I want to understand how snow, which is a really small thing, affects much larger things like ice core records of climate change or radar signals.
I want to know about the Arctic water cycle and how climate change is affecting things like snowpack, snowfall, river water, soil temperatures, permafrost.
I'm highly interested in fluvial and coastal geomorphology in polar world and how the changes in permafrost and sea ice processes will influence them.
I'm interested in understanding the implications of economic globalization for northern communities dependent on natural resources.
And what I want to know is how the sea ice, as it disappears, is going to affect you.
My goal is to understand the migration of plants into the Arctic following the last glaciation.
So I'm doing CS modeling, so both the Arctic and Antarctic. So I just want to know, how sea ice changes as climate warms.
I like to study the gases that come out of active volcanoes. Not only do we use this data to try to help predict how and when volcanoes might erupt, but I'm also interested in studying what volcanoes contribute to our atmosphere.
I study primary productivity in the Southern Ocean.
And the goal of my research is to understand how the landscape in the Arctic is changing.
My goal to study climate is to understand man's impact and also separate natural cycles of climate variability in Antarctica and the Southern Hemisphere as a whole.
I want to understand how people behave themselves, conduct themselves in extreme environments, and what drives them to steer their behavior in a very environmentally conscious way.
And I study the records from glaciers as a history of past climate in regions where we have very little information or history of climate.
I'm interested in understanding how much carbon dioxide the oceans can suck out of the atmosphere, because if there's more in the atmosphere, then there's going to be more global warming.
And my goal in climate research is to study the climate history of the polar regions, Antarctica and Greenland, so that we better understand how these regions will change in the future and impact global climate change.
I want to know how climate change is going to impact people around the world.
My research challenges the notions and assumptions of power within Antarctica.
I study in the McMurdo dry valleys of Antarctica, and I'm interested in how life operates in extreme environments and how it affects the ecosystem surrounding it.
My primary interest is the study of trace gases in the lower atmosphere in the Arctic and their reactions with ice surfaces and aerosols.
I like to study the Arctic because I'm interested in how climate change will affect the plants both on land and in the Arctic Ocean itself.
I want to understand how leaders make decisions on a large natural gas pipeline intended to be built from Alaska to mid-continental United States.
And we're trying to understand how the climate changed in the last 30,000 years in the Arctic, and what was the answer of how the ecosystem responded to these changes.
I work with climate models, trying to improve them to account for the changes in sea ice that are a result of climate change.
I am interested in the way that a changing climate is altering the fire regime in Alaska, and how the changes in fire might influence changes in vegetation.
And I'm interested in how microbes interact with each other in the ocean.
I want to know how Antarctica's ice system responded the last time the Earth was as warm as it's predicted to be in 50 years.
I want to understand how the climates of different regions have changed over the past 10,000 years, so we can better understand how they're going to change in the future.
I want to understand how climate change in the polar regions are affecting people who live outside the polar regions, because that's where the majority of the global population resides.
I study microbial community structures in Antarctic lake and ice ecosystems, and I focus on their adaptation mechanisms and how solar radiation affects their food sources.
I'm interested in understanding how changes in sea level, climate, and tectonics have shaped the landscape over time, both onshore and off.
I work in Arctic Alaska, and I want to understand how Arctic Alaskan lakes interact with their surrounding landscape.
I study the diving physiology of emperor penguins and seals to try to figure out how they can dive for so deep and to hold their breath for so long.
I study who eats who in Arctic lakes and how that affects the pollutant concentrations in the fish in those lakes.
I like studying the coastal Arctic Ocean because it's a complex environment, and I like trying to find simple patterns in complex systems.